Hello and welcome to the DVB Newsroom. I'm Nora. I am joined in studio by Isabel Todd, the coordinator of the Special Advisory Council for Myanmar. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Nora. Thank you for having me.
Now, Isabel, the SAKM was founded by 3 international experts on Myanmar. How has it advocated internationally for Myanmar over the last 3 years since the 2021 military coup?
Well, perhaps, Nora, I can give you a bit of background on the 3 members that formed SAKM, because that will help to explain a little bit about the advocacy that we've been doing since forming. So as you say, SAKM was formed in 2021 in response to the coup by Yang Hee Lee, Marzuki Darusman and Chris Sidoti. But their relationship with Myanmar went back much further than 2021, because as you say, they were all of them UN mandate holders on Myanmar in the years preceding 2021. So I'll tell you a bit about what that means. Yang Hee Lee was the UN Special Rapporteur on Myanmar from 2014 to 2020. And that means that she was mandated by the UN Human Rights Council to report to the UN on the human rights situation in Myanmar. So that mechanism still continues. The current Special Rapporteur is Tom Andrews. So between 2014 and 2020, Yang Hee was reporting on what she saw as probable violations being committed by the military in Kachin State, Northern Shan State, Northern Rakhine State. And she could see that the government at the time wasn't interested in undertaking any independent investigations into those violations. And so Yang Hee recommended that the international community set up its own independent investigation, which it did. And this was the Independent International Fact-Finding Mission for Myanmar. Now, Marzuki Darusman and Chris Sidoti were appointed to that fact-finding mission. So they conducted a 12-month investigation into the reports of the violations, and they found that, yes, indeed, the military had committed war crimes and crimes against humanity in Kachin and Northern Shan states and Northern Rakhine, and also possible genocide in Northern Rakhine. So they recommended in 2018 that because they couldn't see any avenues for justice to take place inside Myanmar, because the courts were not independent, the constitution protected the military's impunity, they recommended that as a matter of urgency, the leaders of the military should be prosecuted in international courts for the crimes of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity. Because if the impunity continued, they felt that the violations would get worse. So this was back in 2018, and we're still pushing for that recommendation to be realised. But just to go back to the end of their mandates around 2019, 2020, they had some quite extensive consultations with civil society, Myanmar civil society at the time. And it was really put to them by civil society whether they would continue working, doing advocacy and providing advice to civil society on how to take these recommendations forward, but in an independent capacity. It didn't happen straight away for various reasons, because of COVID and other reasons, but then 2021 and the coup happened, and they thought, okay, we really have to do something now. So that's why SAKM was formed at that point. I came on board. I'd worked previously for Yang Hee Lee during her mandate. So that's a bit of the background of who the SAKM advisors are. What they've been doing in the 3 years since then, to answer your question, is really to try and use their combined collective knowledge of the international system, how it works, and also the platform that they have, being quite well known within that system, to push the international community to do 2 things. One, put pressure on the military so that it stops the violations, and also to deliver justice, and two, to support the democratic movement. So that's really the focus of what we try and do. And we do that in different ways by releasing statements, publishing briefing papers and reports. We engage a lot with governments. We go to the UN in New York and Geneva and meet with diplomatic missions there. And we also provide ongoing strategic advice to individuals and groups in the democratic movement about how their efforts can also try to push the international community to meet its obligations to protect the human rights of Myanmar people.
How effective has the SAKM's advocacy been in influencing policies on Myanmar?
It's a very good question. I hope that we've had some influence. I mean, there are certain areas that we really do focus on a lot. I've mentioned accountability. That's really one of the key areas that we want to push forward. We want to see that first recommendation that the leaders of the military be prosecuted. We want to see that happen. And at the moment, there are some barriers because there's still no court, international court, that has jurisdiction over all of the crimes that are being committed in Myanmar. So that's something we're really, really pushing for. And I hope we can be effective in that. And we'll be effective, especially if we're joining hands and joining voices with people from Myanmar. But that's where the focus needs to be, on accountability, finding this jurisdiction. Another area that we've focused on a lot, which became apparent quickly after the coup as being an area that there really was a need, is on the question of recognition of the military or the NUG. We saw very quickly after the attempted coup, there was a big danger that the international community was going to recognize the military as being the government of Myanmar, because the international community just wants to get back to business as usual as quickly as possible, and they just want one entity that they can engage with in order to do that. So we have done a lot of work trying to demonstrate and show that the military is not the legitimate government, and an important aspect of that is showing that the NUG has by far the greater claim to democratic and legal legitimacy. And just by there being that challenge there, that has kept the military out of many international forums. So I think we've hopefully contributed to those efforts. We've also focused a lot on the role of the UN. There are several reasons for that, partly because of the background of Yang Hee-Chris and Marzuki, having been not inside the UN system, but connected to it. And they also previously recommended that the UN conduct an inquiry into its actions in Myanmar, on the basis that there had been serious failings in the run-up to the 2016 and 2017 atrocities in Rakhine. So they've seen the UN fail before in a situation of crisis in Myanmar, and they consider that it's failing again. And so we've focused a lot on the role of the UN. I think perhaps some of the pressure that we've brought has led to some minor changes, but there's so much more to be done. So I think we have a very limited role to play, pushing the international system to do these key things. There's a lot of work to do.
As coordinator at SAKM, how do you respond to the fact that Myanmar doesn't get the international attention other conflicts do?
Yeah, this is a really good question, and it's very frustrating for us. One of the main ways that we push for Myanmar to be kept on the international agenda is through these missions, these trips that I mentioned that we do. We go to the UN in New York and Geneva, and we meet with as many diplomatic missions to the UN as possible to try and keep their focus on the situation inside Myanmar. But another thing that we've tried to do is really draw attention to the fact that the resistance is happening and that things are really changing. Because what we realized quite soon after the attempted coup, when we went to go and meet with governments, is that they weren't really seeing this. They had just assumed the coup had happened. There were some protests that took place. The military shut them down, and now we're in a situation where the military is in control. We have to wait a few decades, and then we'll see if something can change. This was the perception that we were getting from the international community. So a lot of the work we've tried to do is to give visibility to this really significant movement that's taking place in Myanmar, and the impact that it's having in terms of the military's losses across the country, the areas being liberated by the resistance, and all of this that's being hard won by the Myanmar people. We've tried to really shine a light and get the international community to be seized on this issue, because things are happening and things are changing, and there's an important role for the international community to play in that.
What do you think can be done to bring more global attention to Myanmar's crisis?
It's I think along the lines of what I was saying, I think that we can see through being here and talking to different people that there's a huge amount of work that's already being done, and processes that are underway to rebuild Myanmar as a federal democratic union. That's already happening. I think that internationally, perhaps the understanding or the recognition of that isn't where it needs to be. The international community doesn't quite understand that this process has started. The situation in Myanmar has reached a tipping point. There's no going back to the days of the 2010s, the military's constitution. This process has already started, and it can't be reversed, and it can't be stopped. So for us, trying to understand a bit more about these processes that are underway, these new forms of governance that are being established, all of the dialogue that's taking place, if we can help the international community to understand that that's where the future of Myanmar lies and that needs to be supported, we hope that's something that people can get behind.
So the international community has faced criticism for its lack of a unified response on Myanmar. Why is this? Again,
it's a good question. In terms of talking about the lack of a unified response, I mean, I can talk specifically about the UN, actually, because we've looked quite closely at the role of the UN, and there's some really serious inconsistencies there, and dysfunction within the UN system, where you have some parts of the UN system, for example, the UN bodies like the Security Council, the Human Rights Council, the General Assembly, that have passed a series of resolutions since the attempted coup that really clearly condemn what is happening. They don't recognize the military in any way as anything other than the military. The resolutions recognize the continuing authority of the state councillor and the president, and they affirm the international community's commitment to the democratic will and aspirations of Myanmar people. The resolutions do fall short. They don't mandate really effective action to stop the violations or as much as they should, but they're fairly strong. As I say, much more can be done. But then at the same time, you have other parts of the UN system, like UN agencies, that are engaging with the military inside the country as if it is a government, and not calling it out and not condemning it, and actually submitting themselves to its arbitrary rules and restrictions and playing into its hands. So you have some real inconsistencies there. I mean, to go even further, to bring a specific example of how that plays out you have some UN member states that are imposing sanctions on the military and military entities to cut its access to funds that it's using to buy weapons. And then you have UN agencies that want to maintain a presence in military-controlled areas, Yangon, Naypyidaw, whose presence results in benefits for the military, including in the form of revenue, rent, taxes, currency conversion. So you've got these two parts of the international system really working against each other. So this is really problematic, absolutely, yeah.
Do you think enough is being done to engage with the civilian national unity government rather than the military junta?
No, no, we don't think so. We from the outset have called for the national unity government to be recognised as the legitimate representative of Myanmar in international forums. I mean, this really would be key to have an entity that clearly has far greater democratic and legal legitimacy than the military, representing Myanmar in international forums and working in the interests of human rights and democracy. This would unlock a lot of the international mechanisms that are kind of frozen at the moment or working in the interests of the military. So we're really disappointed that there hasn't been greater recognition of the national unity government. And then at the same time, there's too much engagement with the military in the wrong way. There's a creeping engagement, normalization of relations with the military on the false idea that it is some sort of government, maybe not a legitimate government, but a de facto government, when it's neither. But that plays into the military's hands. It's not enough to save the military from what's happening, but it is bolstering the military and prolonging this period of violence and conflict in Myanmar. So it is really problematic, and we hope to see much more support for the democratic movement from the international community, including in the form of formal recognition of the legitimate representatives of the Myanmar people.
The remnants of Typhoon Yagi devastated Myanmar on September 9th. Your most recent report outlined how international aid should be channeled across borders. How would this work?
The basic facts are that the humanitarian situation in Myanmar is catastrophic and it's getting worse. And then secondly, international aid is not getting to where it needs to go. I think we can all see that. That's clear to see. So the first question is why? Why is this the case? For us, again, it comes down to what we see as this insistence or obsession on the part of UN agencies and other humanitarian actors to only formally engage with the military on the basis that it's a government in Naypyidaw. And so by doing that, they submit themselves to the military's arbitrary rules and restrictions, including on where they can and can't go. They seem to do this because they prioritize maintaining a presence in Yangon and Naypyidaw and getting visas through the military in order to be there, over effectively delivering aid in the places where it's most needed. And this is a game that the military plays and has played for decades very effectively. So what needs to be done, what we've been saying for years, is that international agencies, UN agencies and others need to just drop this preoccupation with the military in Naypyidaw and focus their efforts on engaging formally with resistance authorities and civil society who've been calling for this to happen for years as well as neighbouring countries, and coordinate a massively scaled up cross-border humanitarian response directly to the areas where people need it, in coordination, as I say, with the resistance authorities and civil society, and critically, a response that doesn't involve the military in the areas that it doesn't control. We think there's been some informal steps taken in this direction, a slight increase in cross-border humanitarian assistance, but this needs to be the primary way that aid is getting into Myanmar.
Since the military junta controls very little of the country compared to the armed assistance, what does this mean for the future of Myanmar?
This is really important. It's something that we looked at quite a lot. You mentioned territory. I mean, we've looked at it from quite a comprehensive perspective that includes territory, but really assesses the military's claim to be a de facto government, which takes into account various other factors. We found all the way back in 2022, by carrying out this assessment, that even at that point, the military didn't meet the criteria in enough of the country to be considered a de facto government of the country. We did a follow-up to that study, which we released the findings of at the beginning of this year, and found that had only increased. And we think that trajectory is going to continue. Now that's really important because, again, going back to this question of international engagement, international actors seem to still be preoccupied with this idea that the military is somehow one day going to suddenly be able to function as a government and deliver on the basis of that sort of engagement, which it simply isn't. And I think China keeps finding that out the hard way. But what does it mean in terms of the future of the country? As I say, all of the indications that we've seen are that this trajectory is going to continue. The military is going to continue losing territory, losing capacity. But that doesn't mean that it can't hold out and inflict harm for quite a long time yet, because it has access to far superior weaponry and firepower. So what we've been seeing is the military increasingly resort to the use of really, really devastating airstrikes to simply destroy areas that it can no longer control. There was a report, actually, that was released by the UN Human Rights Office just last month, and they found that the rate of civilian deaths that they've recorded as a result of the military's airstrikes has increased by 700% in the last year, which is really, really incomprehensible. So if something doesn't change in terms of the military's access to weaponry, we're really worried that that's going to continue, because we see that the losses are going to continue for the military on the ground. But if it continues to have the capacity to inflict this level of harm, then that's going to be really devastating. So the international community, international actors need to really work together to find any means possible to cut the military's access to weapons, cut its access to any sort of legitimacy that bolsters it strategically, financially, that prolongs its ongoing attacks. This really needs to happen, right away.
Sure. So
but we do see. I'm sorry to jump in, Nora. But I mean, what I would say is that I think the trends that we've seen, they're not going to stop. I don't think that what's happening and what's taking place in the areas outside of the military's control can be reversed. That's what's really coming across very strongly for us now. This process is underway. The process of rebuilding Myanmar is underway. It's just a question of how long it takes and how much harm is inflicted by the military in the meantime.
Sure. So, well, how can the NUG and ethnic groups collaborate more effectively?
Well, look, there are many questions, I suppose, related to that are not for us as SAKM to involve ourselves in those discussions. We do believe that a lot of the support that we're seeing come from international actors, that seems to lean towards the military may in part be because they don't see what the alternative is. So we know that discussions are taking place, that there's a level of coordination and negotiation and work being done to I mean, it's a huge task to try and build a new Myanmar, a new country, and that there are visions for that. Perhaps one way that NUG and ethnic resistance organizations and others could be more effective would be to find ways to communicate that clearly to the international community, so that there's a recognition there of what's happening. Because our worry is that international actors are just defaulting to supporting the military because they don't think there's an alternative, but there is.
Thanks. Thank you so much for joining me in the DVB newsroom. The work of SAKM is important. We hope to see the international community respond more proactively to the crisis in Myanmar.
Thank you so much, Nora. I really appreciate you having me and speaking to me. Thank you.